In the spirit of iterative design, this presentation was built today. So, we're going to work together to make it better. But I went to ChefConf and I was really blown away by what Docker offered. And just to prove to you guys that I'm not a Docker shill, I started working a long time ago in this stuff, and now I work at a company called Fiksu in Boston. We do mobile advertising, plug. But that's me. So anyways, that's not important. What's important is what Docker can do for people's both development environments and production environments. The way I like to think about Docker is that it's effectively GitHub for VMs. In the sense that, much like GitHub has a distributed model with somewhere where you can push changes to, Docker's also set up something similar. And also, to make it fast, it's able to do differentials. So in that sense, when you make a change in Docker, it can actually just bring the bytes forward that changed between where the last place you had saved your VM was to the future place that you had saved it. So what does that help you do? Well, it makes Docker insanely fast. By insanely fast, I mean you can have a VM up. It's not really a VM, it's a container, but in under 40 milliseconds. And you can have a lot of them really quickly. So in a single command line, you can start a Docker from a point in time with a single process running under it, something like Bash or Apache. You can play with that environment. You can apt-get install things. You can yum install things. And you're able to quickly iterate on a lot of different platforms. So it's very quick to instantiate an Ubuntu VM or a Ubuntu container or a CentOS or whatever you like. So what it helps is keep resources isolated and without a lot of cost or overhead. In virtualization, you have to instantiate an entire instance. You need a kernel. You need the whole show basically supporting it. With containers, you actually share the ability of a kernel across a lot of different machines. And so it gives you a lot of the benefits there of not having to do configuration management and basically creating a new environment. It's already all right there, saved for you where you last left off. So the yak shaving sort of, what do I have to do to get to where I want to be problem. So a lot of people who I've talked to about this, in fact, I had a long conversation at ChefConf, is, well, I talked a little bit about this, but isn't it just like virtualization again? Like, aren't you now virtualizing on top of your virtualization? And kind of in a way you are, but it's so lightweight, and with VMs you lose 10 to 15% of the resources of the host. With Docker, you don't have that problem because you're actually just sharing libraries, sharing the kernel directly between what you see and what you get. So it's not slow either to transmit because of the fact that it uses differentials instead of trying to do the entire 10 gigabyte image or 40 gigabyte image or whatever your VM image might be. It doesn't need to transmit that whole thing. It can just transmit what's changed because it uses copy on write. And then the last question that came up a lot at ChefConf was, won't this be just super confusing in the sense that I'm now running Vagrant with VirtualBox, and now I've created a machine there, and now I'm running a bunch of other machines inside of there. Well, the answer is actually it's pretty good. So a little breakdown of the sort of virtualization versus containerization debate. I discussed this a little bit, and it's sort of a slide that you sort of read and then move on. But the idea is that virtualization runs the full kernel. It's slow to launch. You're dealing with minutes of launch time instead of seconds or milliseconds, as the case might be. And without Chef, it would be extremely painful to even do virtualization because you have to set up all the kernel tunings, all the file tunings, all the packages, everything else. Containerization allows you to sort of riff on this by building a system very quickly with a single process. So when you instantiate a container, you basically say, hey, just run bash, and then you can do whatever you want. And it's still a full host operating system, so you can install packages and the normal things, and you can attach storage and other things. So, what's a couple minutes to a developer? Doesn't doesn't seem like a lot of time to, instantiate a VM. Well, I liken it to the same thing that happens with web pages, right? If a web page loads in 6 seconds versus 4 seconds, who cares? Well, it turns out actually that differential is like 50% of your user base. And why wouldn't developers care the same way about how fast they can get to their development environment? So, the same thing happens when you have a build on commit system where you actually need to support building out a lot of, VMs to support tons of developers constantly making commits to their, code bases. What you'd like to have is a lot of space to be able to run different test suites in parallel potentially, or per developer, or whatever strategy you want to take on. But the idea here is that if it's something that you can do quickly, that developers could have a whole suite of VMs running their test suite at the same time. So if you had 1,000 unit tests, you could spin up 100 Dockers and have each one of them run 10 unit tests against the exact same code base, and then take them away. And that whole cycle could happen in minutes instead of half an hour, whatever your standard build time is now. So it's really quick and it's really easy to work with. So what is it? There's this technology that's been around for a long time called LXC, which is Linux containers. A lot of virtual private systems use this technology to give you your VPS boxes and things like that, because it's so cost effective to use, because you're sharing a host operating system and you don't need to subscribe all your resources to VMs. You can just give these small containers and people can grow lots of them without wasting a lot of resources. The same thing applies to your laptop. You don't want to be running 10 Vagrant boxes on your laptop at the same time, because each one is claiming a certain bit of memory, each one's claiming a certain number of resources. Containers are a little bit more lightweight. They don't need to claim as much. So you can run one VM and then have a number of Docker containers sitting inside of it. And that's what the base OS shares. It shares everything. You can easily have Ubuntu 13.10 and Ubuntu 12.04 both have Dockers on the same VM and instantiate them both next to each other and look side by side. Did it make sense to upgrade? Did this break? What's going on? And the Docker index maintains versions much like GitHub. Probably the best feature I saw at ChefConf, it blew my mind, was when someone did a Docker diff, which basically takes your index from one point in time, from another point in time, and tells you exactly what files have been created or changed or added on that system. Or it's shocking. You see this output just like a Git diff, but it's about your entire VM. So if you added something in Etsy, if you added something, you changed the configuration variable, it knows, and you can see it. So if you need to go back in time or forward in time, or you need to code review each other's infrastructure as code, you can do it, and you can do it really quickly. And that was just shocking. I mean, you've never really had that, or I haven't. Maybe somebody else has a better plan for it. So, the development model is, you quickly launch full stacks. So you run 10 Dockers inside of one VM. You can have your Mongo server. You can have your Redis queue. You can have your web server. You can have your load balancer, all in one place, all talking to each other. And that helps you a lot with, dealing with the integration style testing that sometimes people say, hey, I tested it on the production VM. It looked good, but I didn't have access to a load balancer, so I didn't realize that I couldn't do load balancing with my application. And that's a problem. I mean, I've run into that one a few times. So you can also use them as a production environment, which allows you to take larger, say, Amazon instances and run lots of tiny Dockers on them to support whatever application you're running, and quickly be able to reorchestrate what you're running in if you have a surge in a queue, you need more machines to run RabbitMQ, you can quickly, dedicate more resources to that without having to wait to spin up new VMs, waiting for the whole run to complete. So it allows you to sort of be a little more agile with how you use your resources. Docker support is coming. It's still in its infancy. I mean, we're not even at a 1.0 release, but OpenStack's already playing really nicely with it. Elastic Beanstalk has a very nice integration, which is even easier to use than custom AMIs. I don't know if you guys have played with that at all. And sort of the gem that I found was this CoreOS plus Fleet capability. CoreOS is effectively a hypervisor OS, if you think about it that way. It is just designed to run containers in it at some level. And Fleet is actually a way of coordinating what's running across different CoreOS hypervisors effectively. So it'll actually manage redundancy. It'll manage making sure that there's actual machines across physical hardware, different physical pieces of hardware, so that you don't end up having a situation where when one VM falls over, every single one of your web servers fell over because they happen to all be associated with the same VM. So it's really nice. It has confd and etcd default in there to help trigger events. The other tools that are available is Docker.io is very similar to GitHub in the sense that you can actually commit images that you've built up there, and you can get images that people have built. So just like you grab great code out of chef cookbooks that have been shared on GitHub, you grab great images of Mongo or whatever you want to be running out of Docker.io, and you can just use them. You can just instantiate them, say, I like how this was done, or I don't like how this was done, change them, submit them back up as a changed event. And then obviously Chef and Berkshelf support has just been rolling forward. I was just reading a guide to setting it up so that you can use Chef and Berkshelf to actually manage and launch your Docker containers, and all your dependency management can be built into that. So where Docker excels is sort of giving you this quick sort of look at the world. You still need your chefs to sort of give you the changes that need to happen in time. So I see them as sort of a nice dovetail together to work with each other to provide your dependencies and quickly allow you to change what you're working on in infrastructure. So if you want to learn more about Docker, which I do because I'm pretty new to it still, this is some useful information. Their website, their IRC channel, their Google groups, and their Twitter. So yeah, that's pretty much a very fast approach to Docker, and I apologize if I was talking fast. I actually have it set up on my laptop running CoreOS and Ubuntu. It's actually a weird thing to have like OS X running VirtualBox, running CoreOS with Ubuntu on Docker. It seems like it's too much, but it really is very nice to just spin it up, use it, and be done. So the only thing that I have to do that I'm required is, hey, if you like working on cool stuff like this, it's available. So that's my talk. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll take some questions if you want.
Testing. Anybody have questions?
Uh-oh.
We'll do the question. So I'm just trying to wrap my head around this. Is the Docker, they're not full-fledged OSs. It just seems like they're little, like not full-fledged, but somewhat OS.
Yeah, so the way it works is, at least with CoreOS, is that you actually download a base OS or a series of bases OSs. So like Ubuntu or whatever, and there'll be these little images. And then when you spin up your Docker, it's actually using that same shared kernel and libraries to be able to give you your container that's an isolated environment.
Okay, so then you would use Chef to sort of configure those little Docker containers, deploy your application, test it, and run it. And then if you wanted to if you wanted to run that application actually, or that VM in a different VM, like a standalone VM, it's just basically take that Chef and your new code or whatever, and just use that to deploy.
Yeah, and you could actually save your Docker at that point once you've gotten your gold Docker or whatever you want to call it, and then just put it on any other VM you want. So if you have a totally different architecture in production, it doesn't matter because your base OS is what's going to be running this Docker, and that's something that'll come along with the deployment strategy.
Do you know if this works with Red Hat at all? Or the
It does.
Okay,
it does. Yeah. Yeah.
We should say that there is a Boston Docker Meetup that John and I attended weeks ago, which was really good. So if you're really interested in this, you should definitely check out their Meetup. They meet fairly regularly, and they're really good.
They had a huge group. I mean, it was about this size, and everyone was purely Docker. Like, how can we integrate this better into our world? So,
Do you have any experience with quality of service and containment of these Docker containers? I mean, how much they can influence each other?
I didn't quite catch you. Sorry about that.
Quality of service element of it. You have experience with that? If you run that in production and one Docker container is misbehaving?
No. So I stumbled upon this from ChefConf, which was a couple months ago. and I'm playing around with it locally in the development environment. Most people, the article that I read was that a lot of people are chomping at the bit to put it in production, but they're waiting for the 1.0 release to do it. So, which is coming this year.
You can constrain resources. So, for instance, like with OpenSnapDriver, you could say, I have one vCPU,
Okay.
and I have this much disk, and you can, like, sorry, this much memory. You're constrained to that.
Okay.
Within the. It's not even the hypervisor's kernel; it's the kernel's kernel.
Yeah.
These are just kernel.
You can control the tunable so it won't just run rampant and eat your entire world. But no, for bug fixing, I mean, it's so new. I don't know if if there's something wrong there. So.
Yeah, so when you deploy Dockers inside of like a large, AWS instance, how does networking happen, and specifically like the IP address assignment?
That's a great question. So from what I've noticed, just playing around with it, I haven't dug into the networking side. It grabs a private IP and sort of uses the same interface as the host OS, and it sort of just nats it out. Yes.
I got a question. Have you tried this with Test Kitchen or anything? How well does it work?
Not yet. No. I've basically just been fooling around with just manually installing packages and watching like a web server come up on my laptop and being like, how the hell did that happen? It was like 5 commands. It was pretty intensely good.
I love what you were saying about like users leaving pages very quickly and developers leaving their virtual environments if the same thing happens. So I was curious, like, what do you think the Docker diff offers that, say, a diff of your provisioning files or a diff of the Docker file itself in version control doesn't offer?
Right. It blocks on things like the guy who forgot to commit his stuff, or the guy who committed over someone else's stuff, or the merge conflict that destroyed your life, or it's reality, right? So whatever's on that Docker is what's going to production. It's not abstracted in any way. So you can look at those diffs and say, man, that shouldn't have been touched. Why is that different? Oh, I shouldn't have touched that. So,
yeah, as opposed to something getting swallowed up by like a force push or whatever. Yeah,
right.
Cool.
You still need like the docker.io though. Otherwise, you lose this VM and you're like, oh, I don't have any of my changes.
Yeah, but I see what you're saying. I like that point about it. And I had one other question about the virtualization aspect. Mm-hmm. So, like the thing about AWS and responding to scale events and custom AMIs that work really well is that you kind of cut down the boot time, right? Mm-hmm. And you get your thing up and configured and put in your array and you're good to go. If you're like spinning up a larger AWS server and you're like scaling out these individual Docker containers, you still end up paying for that huge AWS server if you don't really need it. So it seems like you would either just leave it maxed out all the time or still end up using like something like Packer or whatever to like generate your custom AMI and then. Yeah,
so I think that there's a max min game that can be played with what you're talking about, and that's true at each level. Like I spend a lot of time doing this, so it's like, I don't really need an M3 medium. I'm going to run the smaller server because I can get away with it. I think what happens here though is that you can still run that M3 medium and only have 3 Dockers on it, or you can run that i2-4XL and have 100 Dockers on it. It's really if you understand sort of the unit strength of your application at some level. When you're planning auto scaling, the same considerations go into effect. When you make an auto scale group, you're like, oh, I think it'll scale up to this. I think it'll scale down to this. I think you do the same thing with Docker, and Fleet just sort of helps you control sort of oh, I forgot to put everything in different AZs. That aspect to it, things like that. So.
Good question.
Yeah, so thanks. So how does the load balancing aspect of Docker work? You're talking about load balancing. Let's say you've got 10 Docker instances all running the same application stack. Are you virtualizing them? How are you distributing the load via networking? How are you doing that?
Yeah, so I mean, I haven't set this up in production, but if I were going to, The way I think about doing it was I would launch one big machine in each of the AZs that I wanted to be in, like C, D, and E, or A, B, and C. I would potentially have a second set of actual physical machines that are running something like Nginx or HA proxy or all the above, and maybe I have them intercommunicate with each other. In fact, this is a big push in Docker 1.0 and beyond, is creating secure communications and communication pipelines between containers. Right now you just have your regular networking, but I think that they want to get to a point where Dockers can be somewhat safely aware of each other and have sort of build their own backend network.
So if you look at the dates, there's a project that is called Heroku, which takes care of all that. So you have a bunch of host servers, containers, sort of other projects out there that we're using. So you mentioned the containers just registered themselves, and then it's care of all.
And yeah, and CoreOS has etcd set up so you can trigger that event when a new virtual machine comes up. You can then say, oh, I should register and get these Dockers going. And so auto-scaling, I mean, I don't think all the hooks are there, but I don't know that for a fact. You know, to do a perfect job of, oh, I launched a new virtual machine and now I have the proper Dockers on it and I'm moving forward. But it seems so attainable that I can't imagine that in the next 6 months, you know, to a year, that will be a model where you can just quickly scale both your VMs as well as your Dockers and change them very quickly too, which I think that for me is the most powerful thing is if you have a queue that's overloaded and you need more resources on it and you're desperate and you're starved, you can get out of that situation very quickly. And that's happened, I don't know, countless times that I've seen. So that's where I see the power is sort of like, I really just want to throw 100 queue servers at this backlog that came in from my customer. I don't really care about anything else. Or, you know, I see too much load, I need to shed it. You know, I can just spin up more web servers or whatever element in your stack is missing. You can quickly deal with the fact that it's having problems instead of just having a bad customer experience. So.
Good question. Does Docker work on Amazon Linux?
Good question. I don't know the answer. I don't see any reason why it wouldn't, but
Just curious.
yeah.
So a couple more questions is, do you have to use Docker IO or can you use any other Git server?
That's a good question. I don't know of any others that exist. I don't think it's the same as GitHub in the sense that it's actually Git.
Okay.
It's Docker. And that doesn't mean that, one, they won't release it in a way that you can just run it yourself, or two, someone else is going to reverse engineer it and have their own copy of it. So, yeah, you can create repos on Docker IO. It's similar.
Yeah, I mean, we have Git servers running in our place. I'm just wondering, do I have to run it in Docker?
I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. So you might be able to port it right in.
And then
okay.
What's the cost on this? Like, I'm guessing it's not free.
So Docker private repos start at $7. So I think their model is similar to GitHub in the sense that they just want you to use them to store your code. But I'm not sure they vetted a true. I think this sort of organically grew up, and it's not. I mean, they're working on a revenue model now. They just. I don't think they have one that's strong.
Have you used the Docker Vagrant provider or the Vagrant Docker provider?
I have. Yes, I have actually. I installed it last night or 2 nights ago.
How well did it work?
It was great.
Did you do it on a Mac?
I did. Yeah. There's this great guide which I meant to link here that I didn't link that talks about how to set up Vagrant into CoreOS into Docker containers running Ubuntu. That's like I said, it's like 5 commands. It's smooth as silk. It just works.
Nice.
So.
Cool. You know. Sorry, I'm lighting people up.
I just had to refresh my memory, but I heard the question about Test Kitchen earlier, and there is a Sean Porter, Heavy Water, wrote Kitchen Docker, so that's worth a look definitely, and that's been out there for about a year.
That's awesome. That sounds great.
Anything else?
Did we make it? Good. I made it out alive. I'm going to go to sleep now.